Hello, welcome everybody. You are here for the last and final installment of Scary Stories Past and Present. With us today, we have Sumiko Saulson, who is a fantastic Bay Area horror author. I also love that Z is dressed up perfectly for the stories that we'll be hearing today. We have first part of Here Novella, Ashes and Coffee, which is based on the post-short story, Masque of the Red Death. So we're going to hear both today. We're going to have Sumiko read, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A. If you have a question for our lovely author, go ahead, post it in the chat. Just so we don't have many people trying to talk at once. And welcome. Thank you so much for coming. Sumiko, would you like to introduce yourself a bit, talk about the story?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll be happy to do that. And also would appreciate a reminder about how long I'm supposed to be reading from the story. But
oh yes, about 20 minutes. I'll stop you if it gets. Okay. Also, we can do less if that's preferred.
20 minutes is fine. It might end up being the whole actual novella in that period of time, to be honest. But okay. If it's not, then it's an excerpt. So yeah, you'll let me know.
Either way is good.
Yeah, either way works. So Ashes and Coffee is definitely a story that has a strong nod to Masque of the Red Death. And has a lot of themes about classism in it that you will find in the original Post story. This particular story takes place in Berkeley, California, which makes it particularly appropriate, and centers around homeless people that are staying in Berkeley near the People's Park area. And given that, what's happened with the long history of People's Park, and now it basically, everything that it stood for being now, taken apart, dismantled. I feel like this is a particularly poignant tale to be told at this time about homelessness, about classism, and about how the fact that people live in different class strata make it so that sometimes something horrible could be affecting a community and everyone turns a blind eye to it until it starts to affect the rest of us, which is definitely what Masque of the Red Death is about. It's about hubris, it's about pride, and it's about classism. And so is Ashes and Coffee, a tale of plague and redemption. I am probably going to get a water before I start reading because I just realized
Please do.
Minutes. My name is Sumiko Saulson. Although I am originally from Los Angeles, California, I have been living in Oakland now for 13 years and started my career as an author in Oakland. So I am widely considered to be an Oakland author. I've lived in the Bay Area since I was 19 years of age. That's a long time. I'm 54. I write for the San Francisco Bayview, which is a national Black newspaper. I have won awards for Afro-Surrealist writing and for horror writing. So those are genres that I am associated with. And this tale actually fits into both of those categories, as it so happens. Okay, I'm gonna get a water, I'll drink
that. While Sumiko takes care of getting some water, I'm just gonna say, one, definitely check out her stuff. This recording will go up on YouTube, and I'm going to include a link to Sumiko's website. Fantastic writing. I'm so excited to share it with y'all. And oh boy, is he prolific too. So lots to read. I'm also just going to say that this is the present part of our Scary Stories Past and Present. behind me, you will see evidences of the past part. I'm sitting upstairs in the Berkeley Public Library Central Branch's 5th floor. It is reopening on November 7th. We're so excited to see you guys up there again. We've got our record player, and behind me is one of like 17 four-story stacks of records. There's a lot to listen to. The rest of the room is CDs and books, and song scripts, music scripts, I should say. So we are just really excited, and what an excellent way to celebrate, and also to celebrate Halloween. All right, Sumiko, take it away.
Thank you. Ashes and Coffee. Peter Simpson slept the greater part of 3 days. He slept most days now. The 2 California cities where he slept were known for UC Berkeley and Occupy Oakland, respectively. And Peter was a graduate of Occupy, but he never made it to UC. He was sitting across the street from Good Hope Drop-In Center on Alcatraz near Telegraph. He was one of its daily dispossessed denizens, a regular. It was one of the many homeless day centers littering the borders between Oakland and Berkeley, California. His long brown fingers were curled tight around a thick paper cup. Inside it was a lukewarm mixture of shelter coffee and powdered hot chocolate he called ghetto mocha. Half a mile up the street on Telegraph, college students paid $4 for real mochas at Tully's or Pete's. Sometimes, if he was lucky, he might have one of them buy him a cup of steaming sweet chai or rich brown Sumatra while he was out panhandling. He wasn't down by the college today, though. You couldn't smoke on a public sidewalk there. He was sitting on a stoop across from the drop-in center. He wasn't really sitting, though. He was nodding out. "Wake up, Pop Pop," the young girl sitting beside him said. She was about 19, young enough to be his granddaughter. She wasn't, though. She looked like she might have been. Her birth name was Cherise Montgomery, but everyone called her Red because she wore her hair in a short scarlet mohawk. Her skin was as brown as the coffee and chocolate mixture in Peter's cup. The cup sank low in Peter's unsteady hands. His body was beginning to lisp like a ship taking on too much water. Red was smoking one of the homemade cigarettes they called rollies. Every once in a while, she would nervously tap the ash into the industrial-sized tin can that served as their ashtray. She smashed it out against the inside wall of the can. The fiery cherry broke off and died out in the smelly brown sludge of the water and the ash at the bottom of the rusty can. Her hands freed, she reached over and plucked the cup out of the fingers of her sickly companion. She called Peter Pop Pop because he was her street family. She'd been a runaway on the street since she was 15 years old. She was a grown-up now, but Pop Pop still looked out for her. Now it was time for her to look out for him. They sat beneath the umbrella of an ancient oak tree. Beside them, a low hibiscus tree, a hummingbird traveled from flower to flower. If he had been conscious to see it, Peter would have said it was living proof of his life's philosophy. He believed that sunshine was free and it shined down on you whether you were rich or poor. But he was too sick for bullshit platitudes and street philosophy right now. His fingers used to be as strong and brown as the branches of an oak tree. Now they were pale and ashy as broken twigs drying up on the ground. Something was wrong with him. Red shook him for a second, and Peter tipped right over. He sprawled across the low stairs, spilling his coffee and cocoa. The teenage girl stood over him, crying and screaming. Death was the great equalizer. Death didn't care how old you were. It would break you down wordless and squalling like an infant. This young woman found out the moment her substitute father's head hit the ground. She cried just as loudly as any little one would in the wake of the collapse of their parents. One of the volunteers at the drop-in center poked his head out to see what the fuss was about. He was a dull-eyed intern with a sort of blasé attitude about his job there. He thought it would look good on his college applications as an extracurricular activity, but spent much of the time on the phone with his girlfriend. By the time he freed up his cell phone to call the ambulance, Peter was already dead. Peter Simpson was a Vietnam War veteran. His body would be shipped up north to be buried alongside rows of other servicemen under a generic marble stone. Servicemen would play taps at his interment. A flag would be folded in his honor. There would be no relative to receive the flag. Simpson died without a wife or children. He was a gay man who served his country long before Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Red and the rest of his ad hoc family cried for him. They held a memorial over bottles of Old English and cans of Four Loko in People's Park. His political friends from Occupy Oakland bemoaned the fact that the Veterans Administration treated him better in death than it ever had in life. They held a protest in his honor, Occupy the VA. Other than that, it seemed like just one more tragedy on the street. That was before the disturbances began to happen. Death walked the streets that summer. He was no bony-fingered specter from a Halloween display. He wore no hooded cloak. Death was a nattily-dressed fellow in black and gray checkered fedora. He brushed by Red Montgomery and Pop Simpson in a terrible rush at the ass end of June. Pop was 6 days past his expiration date with a case of walking pneumonia. Death accidentally killed a hummingbird, sending the old man to his release. The little green flitting thing just fell down on its back and hit the ground. It looked like a giant housefly hit with a dose of aerosol poison. Nothing was pretty about a corpse. Even that delicate little bird looked ugly when it was dead. Red was too busy screaming to notice the dying bird as it twitched by her worn-down combat boot. She was calling out to the man across the street when it died. She didn't notice Pop's overly sweetened coffee and hot chocolate as it spilled and washed over the tiny creature's fragile and stiffening carcass. She was too upset to take note of the same sludgy brown liquid seeping into her sock through the hole in her shoe. Death grinned and waved at her. She seemed to be looking right through him, slack-jawed and in shock. It slowly crept upon her, dawning realization that she was staring at death, personified. Why could she see death? And more importantly, why was death paying her any mind? She turned, he turned. He turned his head slowly to face her and gave the young girl a wink. Red felt a rush of cold air roll over her. It prickled her skin. The blood was rushing back as it did when her leg fell asleep. It reminded her of the day she went to the ice skating rink. The nicest foster parents in her long laundry list of scattered childhood recollections took her there for her birthday when she turned 9 years old. She'd never been on the ice before, and she was stunned by the pinprick chills of her ungloved fingers. It felt like that when the fedora man winked at her. Seconds later, he was gone. She felt like he'd never really been there in the first place. She must have imagined it, like a child awakening from a nightmare. She convinced herself it never happened. She let it disappear into the grayer parts of her memory. It wasn't the last time she would see death. The first of the disturbances involved the crickets. Of course, the housed didn't notice it at all when they disappeared. Crickets were like time-displaced roosters to the newly homeless. They didn't wake you in the morning. They kept you up at night with their wicked little mating songs. It was very noticeable. It was a very noticeable thing if you happened to be sleeping in the bushes. Red noticed right away when they stopped. A young man named Marvin Doolittle, who slept at the same park as she did, had also noticed the pervasive silence. He was a white fellow with matted brown hair. He had been wearing the same tie-dye Grateful Dead shirt for about 6 months. He wore cheap plastic sandals during the day, and at night he wrapped his feet in handkerchiefs so they wouldn't get cold while he slept. Marvin didn't need a street name. Everyone just called him Doolittle. He had a couple of cats he liked to talk to. His friends teased him and sang the songs about talking to animals from the old Dr. Dolittle films. His cats were ordinary orange tabbies, a brother and a sister pair named Taco and Belle, after his favorite restaurant. The morning after the crickets stopped chirping, Doolittle found the cats near the bushes chomping on the corpses of dead crickets. No one knew where they were getting them from, but they kept showing up with mouths full of dead crickets. The bushes the crickets lived in separated the grass where they slept from a patch of dirt. The dirt often doubled as a urinal for the men. Doolittle jumped over the bushes to take a morning whiz. Seconds later, he jumped back over. He hopped frantically from leg to leg. He shook his jeans as if to dislodge something, but there was nothing on him. Red went over to take a look at what spooked him. The ground was littered with the corpses of a million crickets. It looked like the aftermath of a biblical plague. Discovering the bugs all of a sudden dead totally freaked Doolittle out. His fear was that the crickets had been poisoned. He didn't want the poison to get to his cats. He began trying to pick the insects out of Taco and Belle's mouths. Unfortunately, he refused to cooperate. Dora was walking by at precisely the moment that Belle, the first cat, died. He lifted a long, lazy finger and pointed at her back with all pointing up in Her tiny body began to seize up a pig like the tobacco chew the corner of her mouth over and dropped to Taco and winked at him. The male cat began to throw up dead crickets, balls. He made a terrible retching noise as he did so. Gave way to blood. His suddenly to one side, and Taco died instantly as his terrified owner looked on in dread. Death seemed to glide across the sidewalk. His slither wasn't ghostly or ethereal. It was an old pimp strut, visible roller skates. He turned to Red, odd sardonic smile. She didn't scream, but she shriveled up inside. Her heart felt like a salted prune, dried up and dead. It wouldn't beat again, and the strange man disappeared. Something was gravely amiss in Berkeley. Red knew it, but who was going to believe her? She was young, Black, female, and out in the streets. She was also a lesbian. These were strikes against her. A girl like her could get shot for acting, for asking for help, like Renisha McBride had in Detroit. Let's get out of here, Doolittle, she said, looking at her friend with concern. Usually a homeless woman needed a man for protection. Red never picked up a street boyfriend. She looked out for herself. She wasn't even sure she was into men in any way. Gutter punk romances always seemed to end badly. Someone got drunk and knocked on someone's teeth out, and usually it was not the girl, but one of the two dumbasses who was fighting over her, and that wasn't a guarantee, though. Domestic violence victimization was rampant among homeless women, and that's why she stuck with the old man, Pop Pop. He wasn't her dad, but he treated her like he was. Pop Pop also looked out for Doolittle. He was like her street brother, she supposed, but she didn't feel close to him. She related to him the same way as she did the kids in the foster homes she'd been in. They were just two people being tossed life rafts from the same sinking ship. Still, his cats were dead. She gave him a clumsy hug. Doolittle's t-shirt reeked of stale body odor and cheap weed. His breath smelled like rot gut and tooth decay. 3 of his front teeth were caved in or missing. She was used to it, but she turned her face downward anyway. Dental care was damn near impossible for the homeless. Red kept a toothbrush and a tube of toothpaste down at the drop-in center. I gotta go bury my cats, Doolittle said sorrowfully. If you can, ground score some popsicle sticks and make those little crosses you do with the yarn. We can use those for a tombstone. Yeah, Red sighed. She kicked at a loose rock and watched it flying across the grass onto the sidewalk. The idea of a day alone now that Pop Pop was gone terrified her, and she was tempted to follow Doolittle just to avoid being alone. Instead, she waved goodbye and turned to go. The second disturbance involved pigeons. An old woman named Missy Sue Ellington used to feed them on a park bench outside of the church, where Red got her free breakfast every morning. It was a tall, beige A-frame building with a single spire. The doorways were high and arched. There was a single round stained glass window inset into the wall over the door. Several tall, vaulted stained glass windows lined the interior. The homeless sat on the pews between them every morning after the day they funneled into the optional service before breakfast. The service might be optional, but those who attended were first in line. The spire was high up enough to provide a nesting ground for the pigeons. Those clever, displaced cliff-dwelling birds were always looking for lofty and elevated spaces. None of them nested in the gutters of the dormitory complex of the college across the street. Red was standing in line waiting for a cafeteria tray full of toast, fruit, and oatmeal when the first one dropped from the sky. It was a young nestling, gray, and mostly featherless bird. Whether it fell or was pushed was something that none of them would ever know. The tiny bird plunged head down first from the steeple. She saw it land on a tray of the woman in front of her with a splat. She saw it all broken neck and twisted wings, its innards spread like a splatter of strawberry jam on the single piece of dry white toast. Then the rest followed. One by one, pigeons plummeted from the sky. They pelted the ground, any and everything that stood between them and the pavement. Windshields cracked, and the struck by the birds were left battered and bruised. No one was seriously hurt by the 82 pigeons that dropped from the sky. Red wouldn't have known their number if it hadn't been reported in the morning paper. She walked by the stand in front of the CVS pharmacy and read the headline through the plastic shield on the newspaper box. The CDC had announced that the cause of the bird's death was a particularly aggressive strain of the avian flu. Death walked by in a dapper new black fedora with a blood red headband and a scarlet feather. He tipped his hat at her and winked. He looked very dapper in his dark gray pinstriped suit with the peg leg pants and the ruffled maroon undershirt. He had a pair of old school creeper shoes, like the ones her Uncle Felix used to wear back in the 80s. They were made of cowhide and dyed the same color as the port wine stain her uncle had on his neck. Oh, that red color, a prism of blood. The hues and tones were bleeding through the musty morning and peering at her wickedly through the rising fog. She remembered reading Edgar Allan Poe's Masque of the Red Death at the Berkeley Public Library over on Kitteridge and Shattuck when she was a kid. She was a kid 4 summers ago. She wasn't a kid anymore. The Red Death was stalking her, and she walked past the 7-Eleven on Telegraph Avenue. She ran inside and bought herself a $2 breakfast of coffee and donuts. She purchased it with the change she had found sitting in the coin return newspaper stands. The edge of the yellow painted wall of the parking lot and eating. She pretended she was one of the college students who could afford expensive espresso drinks between classes. She poured in packets of hazelnut and French vanilla creamers. As she carried the coffee with her over to People's Park, she thought about the wonders of coffee. Even cheap 7-Eleven coffee put out a delightful, earthy, and pungent aroma. It was strong enough to overpower the stench of human urine that escaped from the alley as she walked past. When she entered the park, it complemented nature's fragrance of fresh cut grass, ornamental plums and apricot trees, and dry brown earth. It trailed in and out of the powerful smells of stale sweat and foot fungus that alerted her nose to the presence of her still sleeping friends. The third incident took place in People's Park. It occurred approximately 24 hours after the pigeon incident. Red almost tripped over someone asleep on the ground in a thick, dusty sleeping bag. One of the women in line with her during the mass death of the flying rats was named Tammy Block. She was lying on the floor at Red's feet when Tammy first began coughing. When Red looked down to see what was going on, she saw that Tammy was sporting a nosebleed. She was also looking a bit woozy. Red dropped to the floor and sat cross-legged next to Tammy. She fished 3 7-Eleven napkins out of her pocket and handed them to the sick woman. Red had been saving them in case she had a restroom emergency later, and there was no restroom standing by. The other woman seemed to need them more than she did right now. Tammy's complexion was usually the approximate color and texture of a slightly rotted peach that had been rolling around in the dirt. Right now, she looked like a bloated pumpkin on the porch stoop getting ready to implode on a hot autumn sunny day in October. By the time Tammy's jaundiced fingers grasped the offered napkins, her coughing had come to include spitting up blood. It didn't take long before several others joined Tammy in a chorus of hacking, sputtering, spewing, and wheezing. The sounds of respiratory distress serenaded Red from all over the park. By 12:49 p.m., every single person who had been in the line would be spewing blood. Everyone but Red Montgomery, that is. For some reason, she was just fine. Death walked by in a smoky gray suit and an equally hazy fedora and grinned at her. Red glared at him and flipped him the bird. She was leaning against a plum tree at the back of the restroom when the ambulances came. The restrooms at People Park, angular, beautiful, really. The building was covered in murals on all sides. It depicted people doing various happy things in the community. The image contrasted sharply with the gurneys that were being dragged away with the sick and homeless. Red was tempted to stay and make sure her friends received aid, but she was concerned about her warrants. She'd been issued a stay-away order and had been banned from the park. She'd gotten into trouble for drunken, disorderly conduct. She didn't want the police to see her and arrest her, so she skulked away towards Amoeba Records. As she rounded the corner, Death passed her again in a sharp new cherry fedora. He changed clothes more often than a teenage girl changed her mind about lip gloss. "Mary, Mary," he said with a wink as he passed. "Mary, Bloody Mary. My name is not Mary." Red shouted at him. "It's Charisse." Death mysteriously evaporated on a cloud of wind and medicinal marijuana and incense sold by the street vendors in the orange, red, and green Rastafarian caps at the stand on the corner by the Amoeba Record Store. He disappeared so quickly that the passers-by looked at her as though she were insane. For the first time since this all began to go down, Red thought that maybe she was crazy. She must be losing her mind, as people often did out here in the streets. She tossed her arm around her and hugged herself. She tried to warm her body against a cold breeze that wasn't there. The specter of death might be a hallucination, but the sickness that affected her friends was real. It was in the newspaper, or was it? That didn't look like any avian flu. It looked like the Ebola virus or some kind of hemorrhagic fever. And it was also incredibly overwhelming. And first Pop died, and then all the people from the church got sick, and even Missy, the old woman who used to feed the birds, had been carted off on a gurney from a park bench near the corner. Every single person had gotten sick. Thank God that Doolittle hadn't been there with her. She wasn't sure where Doolittle was. When she went to bed last night, he hadn't been there. She decided that he'd gone to seek company from one of his housed friends, Kevin. Sometimes he went over there and they watched DVDs from the library. Kevin lived in a single room occupancy hotel downtown Oakland, and he was allowed to have an overnight guest 5 days a week minimum, so maximum. Well, it was that time of the month near the first. She had carefully planted the popsicle stick and yarn crosses over the spots where Taco and Belle were buried. She had said a little prayer for them and for Doolittle, hoping he was safe. It wasn't like she had a phone to call him. Maybe the deaths of his pets left him depressed. Maybe it was just as simple as that. Without the cats, he had the option of going to Kevin's without getting someone to cat sit for him. Red decided to sit right down there in front of the record store and wait for Doolittle to come by with Kevin. They usually panhandled here. She could see them in her mind's eye, blowing bubbles at the passersby and talking large amounts of shit. They cracked jokes at the students, hoping a laugh would get them a coin or at least a smile. She spread her trench coat down on the ground and sat on it cross-legged. She set down her empty coffee cup from 7-Eleven and began collecting coins in it. It was the first time in days she felt relaxed. Even on the worst day of her life, the sun rose up in the sky and shone down on everyone, the rich and the poor, the healthy and the infirm, the young and the old, all benefited from sunshine. Sunshine was free, just like Pop Pop said. Okay. How much time have I been reading for?
You've been reading. Yeah, let's say that's 20.
Okay.
Sorry, I should have probably stopped you a couple minutes ago, but sorry, I was enjoying it and I lost track of the last few minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for reading. If you are interested in the rest, I know you can get it online through a couple different sources. Do you want to tell people where to find more of your work?
Yeah, so there's my website, which is SumikoSaulson.com. I can post that in the chat. And for the rest of that particular story, Ashes and Coffee, I think I can, I'll give you guys a coupon so that you can get it for free from Smashwords. And
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
It's very kind. Also, the library is working on getting that story and some others in print. We've been having issues with supply chains because who isn't? But it should be coming to the BPL soon. All right. Do we have questions from the audience? Or while we're waiting for questions to come in, I just want to say I see a lot of parallels between Masque of the Red Death and this, particularly I really liked the way that you sort of openly addressed the ways in which Red is unable to trust that she can get help for herself or others. That sort of sense of helplessness, I think, is a big part of the original Poe.
Yeah.
Thank you for adding the coupon code in.
Okay, I'm gonna give the link. I think someone is asking about what
Oh yeah, let me see.
yeah, what
Sorry,
am I
yes.
working on
Lauren
now?
says yes. Sumiko, what are you working on now?
Let's see. So first of all, I am so happy to say that I have been invited to be a part of an anthology called Blackened Roots, which is African diaspora, African Black, zombies. So it's like zombies. So my publisher, Mocha Memoirs Press, is putting that together, and is in the middle of an Indiegogo campaign. I'm raising money for that. And like someone just actually purchased a Tuckerization, like they not purchased, but they did the fundraising thing. So like a Tuckerization is where they like write your name into the story. And so they asked like the writers if we would be down to have them write someone's name into the story. And me and one of the other writers said, yeah. Yes, and someone actually did get that thing, so that was kind of cool. There's a book that just came out in October called what is it? It's called Out of the Closet, Queer Reflections on Horror. So I have an essay in that. Joe Felice edited that. Let's see, my most recent novel that came out, Happiness and Other Diseases, is actually the first in a sequel. So the next one in the sequel should be coming out sometime next year. So I have that coming out. Let's see, I just came out with a book of poetry called The Rat King, which is all like my poems in one book. Because I didn't like, because I realized that they should all be in one book and not just in my other books. So yeah, that happened.
I mentioned before, this is one prolific author. There's so much good stuff out there. I'm excited actually to see the collection of poetry, because I feel like I've seen, like you said, snatches of it in other books of yours. So I'm psyched to just get to sit down and read the poetry.
Yeah, it is actually available. It is called The Rat King. So that's something that you can pick up now. Because yeah, I have had poetry in like pretty much every collection that came out with short stories.
Yes.
Yeah.
Another question from chat. I really love Death's fashion sense. Was he inspired by someone in particular?
Yeah, that is sort of a Papa Legba vibe that you might have noticed about Death and his fashion sense. So yeah. Papa Legba is a character that a Black African, voodoo culture character from around New Orleans, and that is pretty much, that's his fashion sense there.
Yeah, the words dapper that kept coming up, I was like, oh, that's it. That's so perfect. And now that you said that's the inspiration, I'm like, oh, that makes so much sense.
Yeah.
I'm curious about the inclusion of the fedora. Because I know that, I say while wearing a costume that requires one. I know that there has been, in some circles, a discussion of the fact that there's like the concept of, the guy wearing a fedora who thinks he's much more gallant and interesting than he is.
Right. So yeah, without spoiling my own story.
Yes, yeah, we've been trying to have a no spoilers policy for when we do excerpts.
Yeah, there is definitely a reason for that. And gosh, I hate to be spoiling my own stories, but let me put it this way. There's no way to really get into that too much without giving spoilers.
We'll just say, I realize
let me put it, there is definitely a reason why he is a dude that wears a fedora.
Yes.
And
it's very intentional, we'll say.
It's
without
it's very intentional, and as you find out more about him and why he's following Red around and stuff, you know, let me put it this way. Red doesn't really know who her father is, and apparently, yeah.
yeah, we'll say without getting into specifics, it's
Yeah,
connected to Red's family. And the fedora choice is definitely a nod to the cultural
right.
phenomenon of fedora guy.
Yeah, it is definitely a nod to that cultural
I didn't realize
phenomenon.
as I was
It is
asking this, because
true.
I've had the privilege of reading the whole thing, and I like realized as I started answering, I was like, I'm pushing on on you to talk about something later. And I was like, no, wait.
Yeah, right. You've read it. So having read it, if you've read it, you will be able to figure out what significance it
Yes.
is of him being the fedora wearing type of guy.
Yeah. I want to say also, we've got one comment in chat that someone does not have a question, but really appreciated the reading. Which is awesome. If you don't have a question, we're so glad you're here.
Thank you.
I think, let's see, as we get up on 1 p.m., I think we've got the questions asked. Let's give Sumiko's throat a break and switch over to the past part of Scary Stories, past and present. This is in our record collection. Basil Rathbone reading the works of Edgar Allan Poe. For those of you who are like, that name might be familiar, he played Sherlock Holmes a bunch. Basil Rathbone is definitely an actor associated with, if not horror, then at least mystery, which, you know, Poe crosses over into a bit with the Murder in the Rue Morgue. He does a beautiful job reading this, and I'm going to ask for folks' patience as I get the record player started. It is not the first track on this record, so there's going to be a moment of me oh god, of course you're in a corset. Sorry, for those who can't see chat, Sumiko did this wearing a corset, which, wow. I could not have read for 20 minutes in that state. We'd love to have you back sometime, so if we have you back, I'll send you an email saying, hey, don't wear a corset. Yeah, so if you will bear with me for one moment, we're gonna get the record started. I'm gonna play around getting it in the right groove, and then we are going to listen to the original Masque of the Red Death. Someone in the chat says, oh, that's got to be difficult. Double thank you. I love that. All right. Give me one moment here. My video is going to go off as I deal with the tech stuff. Thank you all for your patience. The record player did something. Here we go. Should be working now. We might hear a little bit of, sort of crackling. There we go.
Long devastated country.
Whoops.
No people. What good vapors are
It was in the right place. And there we go. Sumiko, can I get you to turn off your video just so in the recording we don't have to get.
long devastated country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal. The redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains, sudden profuse bleeding at the pores with dissolution. The scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, were the pest ban, cut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow men. And the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of his court, and with these retired to the deep seclusion of one of his castellated abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august taste. A strong and lofty wall girdled it in. This wall had gates of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and Masque hammers and welded the bolts. They resolved to leave means neither of ingress nor egress, with the sudden impulses of despair or of frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned. With such precautions, the courtiers might bid defiance to contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisatori, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. All these and security were within. Without was the Red Death. It was toward the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade. But first let me tell you of the rooms in which it was held. There were 7, an imperial suite. In many palaces, however, such suites form a long and straight vista, while the folding doors slide back nearly to the walls on either hand, so that the view of the whole extent is scarcely impeded. Here the case was very different, as might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bizarre. The apartments were so irregularly disposed that the vision embraced but little more than one at a time. There was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn a novel effect. To the right and the left, in the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked out upon a closed corridor which pursued the windings of the suite. These windows were of stained glass whose color varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chamber into which it opened.
That of the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue, and vividly blue were its windows.
The second chamber was purple in its ornaments and tapestries, and here the panes were purple. The third was green throughout, and so were the casements. The fourth was furnished and lighted with oranges. The fifth with white. The 6th with violets. The 7th apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon a carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber only, the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood color. Now, in no one of the 7 apartments was there any lamp or candelabrum amid the profusion of golden ornaments that lay scattered to and fro or depended from the roof. There was no light of any kind emanating from lamp or candle within the suite chamber. But in the corridors that followed the suite, there stood opposite to each window a heavy tripod bearing a brazier of fire that projected its rays through the tinted glass and so glaringly illuminated the room. And thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. And in the western or black chamber, the effect of the firelight that streamed upon the dark walls through the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look upon the countenances of those who entered that there were few of the company bold enough to set foot within its precincts at all. It was in this apartment also that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang. And when the minute hand made the circuit of the face and the hour was to be stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that at each lapse of an hour, the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performance to hearken to the sound. And thus the waltzers perforce ceased their evolutions, and there was a brief disconcert of the whole gay company. And while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale, and the more aged and sedate passed their hands over their brows, as if in confused reverie or meditation. But when the echoes had fully ceased, a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled as if at their own nervousness and folly, and made whispering vows each to the other that the next chiming of the clock should produce in them no similar emotion. And then after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embraced 3,600 seconds of the time that flies, there came yet another chiming of the clock, and then there were the same disconcert, incredulousness, and meditation as before. But in spite of these things, it was a gay and magnificent revel. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had a fine eye for colors and effects. He disregarded the decora of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery, and his conceptions glowed with barbaric luster. There are some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure he was not. He had directed in great part the movable embellishments of the 7 chambers upon occasion of this great fete, and it was his own guiding taste which had given character to the masqueraders. Be sure they were grotesque. There were much glare and glitter and piquancy and phantasm, much of what has been since seen in Hernani. There were arabesque figures with unsuited limbs and appointments. There were delirious fancies, such as the madman fashions. There were much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that which might have excited disgust. To and fro in the 7 chambers there stalked, in fact, a multitude of dreams. And these, the dreams, writhed in and about, taking hue from the rooms and causing the wild music of the orchestra to seem as an echo to their steps. And anon, there strikes the ebony clock that stands in the hall of velvet. And then for a moment, all is still, and all is silent, save the voice of the clock. Things are stiff frozen as they stand, but the echoes of the chime die away. They have endured but an instant, and a light, half-subdued laughter floats after them as they depart. Now again the music swells and the dreams live and writhe to and fro more merrily than ever, taking hue from the many tinted windows through which stream the rays from the tripods. But the chamber which lies most westwardly of the 7, there are now none of the maskers to enter. The night is waning away, and there flows a ruddier light through the blood-colored panes, and the blackness of the sable drapery of halls. And to him whose foot falls upon the sable carpet, there comes from the near clock of ebony a muffled emphatic, and any which reaches their ears who indulge in the more remote gaieties of the other apartments. But these other apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly the heart of life. And the revel went whirlingly on until at length there commenced the sounding of midnight upon the clock. Then the music ceased, as I have told. The evolutions of the waltzers were quieted, and there was an uneasy cessation of all things as before. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell of the clock. And thus it happened, perhaps, that more of thought crept with more of time into the meditations of the thoughtful among those who revelled. And thus too it happened, perhaps, that before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure which had arrested the attention of no single individual before. The rumor of this new presence having spread itself whisperingly around, there arose at length from the whole company a buzz or murmur, expressive of disapprobation and surprise, then finally of terror, of horror, and of disgust. An assembly of phantasms such as I have painted, it may well be supposed that no ordinary appearance could have excited such senses. In truth, the masquerade license of the night was nearly unlimited, but the figure in question had out-Heroded Herod and gone beyond the bounds of even the prince's indefinite decorum. There are chords of the hearts of the most reckless which cannot be touched without emotion. Even with the utterly lost, to whom life and death are equally jests, there are matters of which no jest can be made. The whole company seemed now deeply to feel that in the costume and bearing of the stranger neither wit nor propriety existed. The figure was tall and gaunt, and shrouded from head to foot in habiliments of grey. The mask, which concealed the visage, was made so nearly to resemble the countenance of a stiffened corpse that the closest scrutiny must have had difficulty in detecting the cheat. And yet all this might have been endured, if not approved, by the mad revelers around. But the mummer had gone so far as to assume the type of the Red Death. His vesture was dabbled in blood, and his broad brow, with all the features of the face, was besprinkled with the scarlet horror. When the eyes of Prince Prospero fell upon this spectral image, with a slow and solemn movement, as if more fully to sustain its role, stalked to and fro among the waltzers, he was seen to be convulsed in the first moment with a strong shudder, either of terror or distaste, but in the next his brow reddened with rage. "Who dares," he demanded hoarsely of the courtiers who stood near him, "who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Seize him and unmask him, that we may know whom we have to hang at sunrise from the battlements." It was in the eastern or blue chamber in which stood the Prince Prospero as he uttered these words. He rang through the 7 rooms loudly and clearly. The prince was a bold and robust man, and the music had become hushed at the waving of his hand. It was in the blue room where stood the prince, with a group of pale courtiers by his side. First, as he spoke, there was a slight rushing movement of this group in the direction of the intruder, who at the moment was also near at hand, and now with deliberate and stately step made closer approach to the speaker. But from a certain nameless awe, with which the mad assumptions of the mummer had inspired the whole party, it was found none to put forth hand to seize him, so that unimpeded he passed within a yard of the prince's person, while the vast assembly, as if with one impulse, shrank from the center of the rooms to the walls. He made his way uninterruptedly, but with the same solemn and measured step which had distinguished him from the first, through the blue chamber to the purple, through the purple to the green, through the green to the orange, through this again to the white, and even thence to the violet, ere a decided movement had been made to arrest him. It was then, however, that the Prince Prospero, maddening with rage and shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers, while none followed him on account of a deadly terror that had seized upon him. He bore aloft a drawn dagger, and had approached in rapid impetuosity to within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure, when the latter, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, turned suddenly and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, The dagger dropped gleaming upon the sable carpet, upon which instantly afterwards fell prostrating death the Prince Positive. And summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of revelers at once threw themselves into the black apartment, and seizing the mummer, whose tall figure stood erect and motionless within the shadow of the ebony clock, gasped in unutterable horror at finding the grave cerements and corpse-like mask which they handled with so violent a rudeness, untenanted by any tangible form. Now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. They come like a thief in the night. One by one dropped the revelers in the blood-bedewed halls of their revel, and died each in the despairing posture of his fall. The life of the ebony clock went out with that of the last of the gay. And the flames of the tripod expired. And darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us. We've finished up a little quicker than usual today. This is the one of the very few Poe short stories that's on the short side. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us to listen. Thank you so much to Sumiko for joining us, sharing your wonderful work, and also thank you for very unexpectedly sharing that coupon for getting Ashes and Coffee on Smashwords. Happy Halloween, and bidding you a spooky adieu from the library. Thank you for coming to Scary Stories Past and Present.